I'm Martin Wilsey.
I'm Shay McGalley.
And I'm David Keener.
And this is the Hourlings podcast project. Tonight we're talking about war, and Dave's going to be leading the discussion. Dave, take it away.
Sure. All right. We're going to try something a little bit different tonight. We're going to talk about war as context for a story. In other words, we don't have to be writing a story about battles and invasion and explosions and stuff. We can write stories that have war as a backdrop to the story and discuss how that can inform what happens in the story to your characters, the societies, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we capture war in a story? I think the first thing I'd like to ask my fellow hosts here, what are some of the causes of war?
Well, my history professor has a great quote. He says that war happens for only two reasons. One, either to get something, or two, to get something back. So I can see a cause for war being revenge, a very age-old rivalry between two cultures and something that sets it off. What about you, Marty?
Women.
Yes.
No, I think there's a lot of reasons. Real estate, is prime. Resources, power, domination, expansion of empires, especially when you're talking about science fiction and fantasy, the causality can be a lot wider and a lot bigger even. So there's a lot of great reasons for war to happen plot-wise. I mean, there's a metric ton, if you look at every book that you've ever read, every movie you ever watched that has any kind of war in it, the causes of it can be everything from an assassination of an archduke to an insult because this guy's black on the left side of his face. And
yeah, I saw that episode of Star Trek.
yeah, it's really interesting the context of war, how it can inform a story and not necessarily be what the story's about. It's kind of interesting.
I think there's some other possible causes for war too. Religious is often a good one, particularly historically. And I can see that coming into play in a science fiction story or a fantasy story. Ideological, which I differentiate from religious a little bit because it might be not so much about religion, but about how you feel about the universe and how you want to live your life, or how your country wants to do business, that type of thing.
Or which egg you open first when you're eating breakfast.
I'm a history major, and I still have not figured out why World War I started. Like, I have looked at that on every different angle, and I cannot figure out what the actual reason for that war is. So we're talking about like reasons for war. I think it's okay to have your characters who are, maybe not the decision makers of the war, be like, why are we fighting? Like, I really don't get it. I forget. Like, that's a reality that would be a complex and interesting thing to incorporate into a story if you have a war that's not so obvious, like, struggle for a resource that's a survival necessity or something like that.
I think that's possible too, because particularly in places like Europe, I have more knowledge of European history than other parts of the world, but you have a lot of nations that have rubbed against each other for years and years and years. I mean, centuries, thousands of years. And there's a long history of grievances from one side to the other, going back so far that nobody can really look at it and say what started where.
And I like that Marty said land and resources, because you might have to make an argument if someone's fighting over like an arid desert that has no secret spice to it. So when your armies or your wars are over land, think about making it something that has some value to it. Like, if not gold, then some kind of, I don't know, very fertile area, or in many cases in history, people fight over access to harbors or access to good trading ports. So something like that strategically would also be interesting.
Yeah, or trade routes, or
Right.
the controlling the oases that allow you to cross the desert, stuff like that.
Right.
I think another one we haven't mentioned, and it's a difficult one sometimes, is the ethnic cause of war. That has certainly led to a lot of carnage around the world. But I don't necessarily think of these so much as the causes of war, but as the backdrop for why different peoples are coming into conflict. And I kind of look at conflict as something that can flare up into war, but oftentimes there could be long periods of peace.
Yeah, and keep in mind that, we're science fiction and fantasy authors, and you can have more, it doesn't have to be, have a historical context. Somebody thinks that the universe is overpopulated and snaps their fingers and kills half of people. And, that's there's a lot of plots in science fiction context for war that are completely different.
Something that might not be an actual cause of war, but could be a lubricant to heading to war that you might consider adding to your story, is a boom of technology. Maybe a new weapon has been invented, and you see in our own history that mankind sometimes has an eagerness to test it out. So it could be interesting to have a technology that has just been created that is starting to create pressure on both sides to see who's really the strongest.
Well, I think you hit another area, which is things could be in balance, but somehow the status quo gets interrupted.
Right.
So I can think of maybe some other context reasons for that. So I'll throw that out. Other things that might break up the status quo and lead to conflict.
Change of rule.
Okay. You could always go from a good king to a bad king, and stuff can happen, or whatever. Other things?
A natural disaster, perhaps, that is suddenly putting pressure on a civilization that once was peaceful.
Yeah, it's weird. I've done a lot of reading lately on old civilizations that have disappeared. And a lot of times they disappeared for causes due to climate change and things like that. So historically, that has been the reason for a lot of migrations of peoples into territory of other people with the attendant conflict. So if we're writing a story, and we're not going to write a story specifically about war or a military campaign, see if you can give me some examples of contexts in which war could be a backdrop, but you could do an interesting story in that context.
Well, my very first novels, all three of them, one of the foundation premises in there is that a war in the past laid the foundation of the storyline that occurs in the book. And that's really interesting world building effort to build the history, not the current environments, not the current state of the universe, but things that happened 300 years ago that inform us what's going on today. That was a lot of fun to write, and has worked out pretty good in those books.
You could have something sort of like an escape story, a refugee type story from war while the war is going on, a family escaping, a couple escaping, but they're not actively engaged in the fighting.
Right?
Yeah, like the story of Mysterious Island. That took place during the Civil War. They escaped on an air balloon, and it was, prisoners from prisoner of war camp and various other folks. That was in context of the war, but it wasn't about the war.
Right, and I can see setting a story on the home somewhere within the home front while a war is being fought overseas. or the spying behind the scenes to get the necessary information, or perhaps to steal the plans for the Death Star or something like that. You might not be featuring the war itself, but you're featuring something that's important to the war effort.
Yeah, there's a lot of war stories like that, spies with a MacGuffin that were a lot of fun associated with it.
And again, in fantasy and science fiction stories, I think you have the latitude to design your societies and such, you know, to lead to some of the things that you want to have happen in your story. I also feel like there could be, for want of a better phrase, I'll say levels of intensity to the backdrop. You know, for instance, there can be a difference between wars actively going on as opposed to it's brewing and might happen sometime in the future.
Wars and rumors of wars.
Right. So if you guys can think of some examples of different, I guess, intensity levels for the conflict that represents the backdrop. I'll give you one, for instance. Israel versus Palestine is, you know, like constantly simmering and can erupt into flames at any time.
Yeah, something I think your key point there is like concentration. You know, does it happen over decades and decades? Maybe that's too long. Years and years, or is it something that's very acute? And so something that happens years and years, I think the author will have an easier time making that a context or an environment rather than a plot. If it's something that's acute, it might be a little hard to navigate without it being the plot, but possible. But
Right.
concentration.
Yeah, I think that a good example would be like Casablanca. That is in context of it's actually a story about characters, and you don't see any real war fighting or any of that kind of stuff during that movie. Well, not very much, but it's a more subtle story in the context of a war that is actually happening. People talk about it a lot during the movie, but they are not in foxholes shooting each other.
And I actually think that's a fabulous example. I wish I'd thought of it myself.
Hey, off the top of my head, it's one of my favorite movies, by the way. I love that movie.
So how can you use the war backdrop to affect your characters?
Certainly, they can have a loved one at war. I've seen many stories where, you know, the main character's brother is at war and they're writing letters to him and they want to be like him, but then they realize something is, you know, the brother didn't know about this part of the army or this part of the mission, and then some drama happens. So definitely a loved one.
There's a lot of ways that you could use it more as a setting. You know, once you world build the war that's actually occurring, there's a lot of stories that you could put in front of that. You know, it could be, you know, the story of somebody that's, you know, the 24 hours before they're going off to war. Could be somebody that's not involved in the war and is desperately trying to stay out of it. Or it could be a patriot that is trying to get into the front lines and just doesn't. I mean, there's a lot of different stories that you could write for that, especially in the sci-fi context, because you could take the same kind of plot and apply it almost anywhere.
I have seen Casablanca done as a science fiction story.
Right.
By Jerry Purnell, as a matter of fact.
Barbed Wire, starring what's that actress's name? She was in Baywatch.
Pamela Anderson.
Pamela Anderson. She played the Humphrey Bogart role in a Camelot retelling in a science fiction way. It's pretty good for campy fun.
And I can see a few possibilities too. I can see, for instance, throwing two people from opposite sides of the war together in some kind of context where they have to work together, possibly with their own romance subplot. That's always a good one that I've seen. I think it was U-571, the World War II submarine story, where two best friends were serving on the same submarine, and the one friend had to give an order that was going to result in his best friend's death. I can see stuff like that happening. I feel like there's a lot of different ways the context could affect characters. Conflicts also tend to have, they reverberate. So a war, even if it's just between two nations, probably affects not just those two nations, but various nations around it. So let's talk about some of the ways that other nations near the combatants might be affected, and perhaps how you can use that in the story.
Well, I mean, there can always be an ongoing plot, sort of like Benjamin Franklin in France and Thomas Jefferson in France, trying to get support from a country that is otherwise neutral. So that could be an interesting plot line of diplomacy. You know, a war is going on, but your characters are, you know, meeting with these powerful people and trying to plead a case to get someone to finally say, all right, fine, I'll send support, or I'll, you know, I'll ally with you.
Yeah, I always think of, you know, this discussion in the terms of science fiction. You know, it's like, oh, there's other planets in the same solar system. Well, where are they gonna fall out on this? Which side of the fence will they be in? And you can take the same concepts that apply to wars in Europe or, you know, other wars around the world, and, you know, apply in outer space, and the same kind of thing can happen where, you know, hey, I need more spaceships to help fight this, you know, adversary. And then you can add into that wars that are involve aliens, where we have no context, well, even why these aliens are interested. What do they want? You know, it's there's a lot more variables you can do when you're doing science fiction, especially with war as context. Yeah,
I have a story I've started working on where the aliens want to conquer the universe because their religion tells them that the universe is theirs if they have the power to take it. And so that it's a completely religious reason for them to continue expanding their empire, but not something that humans would understand necessarily right away. Also, I can see, you know, one of my favorite examples is the Civil War, which apparently had the opportunity to turn into our first world war, so to speak, because France was thinking about coming in on the Confederate side, and the British were somewhere in the mix as well. And then Lincoln did his Gettysburg Address, clearly from a PR perspective, made the conflict entirely about slavery, and France could no longer come in on the side of the Confederates. You know, so you can see stuff like that happening in the story as well, where other nations have to make choices based on perceptions of the war or impacts to them or things like that. All right, so, and this might be a hard question. If you were going to write a science fiction or fantasy story right now, with war as a backdrop, see if you can kind of ad lib a scenario that you find at least moderately interesting. I'm putting you on the spot. It's fun.
Man, you sure are. You didn't do this during the first take.
Some scientist makes a mistake of advertising the fact that he has found a new substance on a specific planet that creates faster than light travel, and suddenly everybody wants it, and because he decides, okay, who's going to pay me the most money? And adversaries have different ideas on how they're going to get this technology.
I kind of like the diplomat route I was describing earlier. So I can imagine a story I would write where a character is tasked to go and get the support of this neutral country, and perhaps he or she has to get close with a very unsavory and dangerous ruler of this country and keep his back watch to make sure he doesn't get, maybe there's some spies that are threatening him. Maybe there's a little romance with either a spy or maybe one of the royal people in the court, and some betrayals, perhaps. Little character development. throw in some plot, some dialogue.
Yeah, one of the plots that has become near trope that I like is a screwed up first contact situation where somebody does something they don't realize is horribly offensive and
Yes.
starts a war over it. Those can often be fun.
Yes.
So my scenario is an alien race is expanding. Strangely enough, they're the religious ones I talked to you about earlier. And there's a first contact situation. And the humans are under the impression that both star nations are approximately the same size because, your expansion sphere has met our expansion sphere. So, you're not really a danger to us. What they don't know is that now that the aliens know about them, they have sent a massive sublight fleet to take Earth out in 70 years. And this is all backdrop to the story as humans are finding out that they're under this massive threat that started 70 years ago that they didn't know about. And I again, that's something you can do in a science fiction story that I don't think you can do in a conventional war thriller or something like that. All right, any last thoughts about war as context for a story?
I think it'd be fun. It's good world building, and I think I always like the stories where turns out war is a very human construct, and other space races don't get that. That makes it easy for the humans to win. You can have a lot of fun with it. There's lots of space to be original with it, and you can take any kind of war story and turn it into science fiction, and it would be easy. Take a plot like the Bridge over the River Kwai. You could turn that into a science fiction story easy, and it would be fun. Somebody should write that. I think I might write that.
Hey, yeah, you gotta write it down.
I think my last thoughts are war context stories are a great way to exercise and practice your skill of figuring out, what side wants what and how does that make conflict. This country wants this and this country wants this, and so this is why we have a struggle. So when you can work with players and different factions and factors like mercenaries, and the neutral countries we were talking about, the powerhouses, the businesses, the traders, all that. It's a great way to start practicing balancing all that conflict. And it will come, unfortunately, as Marty said, it will come naturally to you because we assume that all our listeners are humans, but we don't know for sure. But so if you are a human listener, there is a part of you where war will come easily.
And I think that's actually a pretty good summary because if there's one lesson to take from this, I think that there are causes behind wars, and that the context of these conflicts are things that drive people's motivations, affect how characters act, affect how nations conduct policies or interact with each other. And if you can accommodate that in your world building so that your war has, real discernible meaning as opposed to, say, a superhero villain who just wants to rule the world but doesn't have any plans for what he's going to do with it once he's got it. I think that you can really use that to inform a story and make your readers feel what the characters are going through.
I would add just one other quick point because you made me think of it, Dave. And it's a caution for our listeners to not just use war as a scapegoat for emotional, emotional takeaways or emotional beats. I have seen stories that they were really complex and really good, and then a war was introduced, and it just became a war story. It just watered it down. And so be careful not to use war as a crutch to your emotional conflicts. Is all your struggle is make sure that it's well backed and saturated. What do you guys think about that? Agreed?
Yep.
It works for me.
Hey, sounds good.
And with that, I think we have come to the end of war as a setting for your stories.
We have solved war. The Hourlings have solved war.
We have not solved war.
No, we haven't solved it. Not even started.
All we've done is we've discussed how you might incorporate it into your story.
I like my ending better.
Hmm.
All right. Well, we'll see you all next week. Ciao.